There's a single most important thing that you can do to dramatically improve your chess performance, and that is learning to blunder less. Hi, I'm Grandmaster Igor Smirnov, and today I'll share with you 3 unknown but highly effective ways to reduce the quantity of blunders. How would you play here as black? Think about this. White has just captured this pawn on g7 and attacked the rook. Now, a lot of players in this position will notice that, okay, I need to do something about the rook, so I can go right here, kick the queen out of here, and then I'll play some other cool move. But here's the problem. Once you played the move rook to g8, then you start noticing that, hey, wait a second, there's actually one major issue with this move, right? Because the queen doesn't have to go back. It actually can capture this pawn f7, and it's not just a pawn, that is basically a scholar's checkmate. Then you're sitting there hoping for your opponent to not notice this, but sure enough, after a couple seconds, he does play queen takes f7, and then you start blaming yourself for instant moves, or maybe you think that you need to solve more tactical puzzles. But I've been coaching chess for 15 years. In person, thousands of people studied my chess courses, and I can tell you that that is not the answer. The answer is to slightly adjust your thinking system so that you can consistently find correct moves. And here's what I'm talking about. Let's take it back. And think about this. When you are about to play a move, now you probably heard that you should avoid instant moves. You should try to ask yourself what your opponent is going to do next. But then, our automatic reaction is to somehow hope that our opponent will retreat back from our attack. But that is not the right way of thinking, because the right way of going about this is actually the opposite. You need to consider dangerous moves of your opponent. And dangerous moves are moves forward on your side of the board that take or attack something. So those are the moves that you really need to think of. And if your opponent goes back, there's really no need to think about that at all, because that doesn't do anything. After that, indeed, we can do whatever, right? So what are the forcing, attacking moves? And most importantly, forward moving moves on your side of the board, right? So if you want to ask yourself this question, you would have noticed that not only queen takes f7 wins the game for white, but also bishop takes f7. That's another move. Moreover, if I take this back, one move back, let me show you what was like the position before that. Once black played knight f6, that was probably the same thing. So right here, black played knight f6, hoping for the queen to go back somewhere, and then black would do something. But again, you gotta apply the right way of thinking. It's not about queen will go somewhere. Like, somewhere is a very dangerous square, because in reality, you gotta ask yourself, what are the forward moves of the queen that can take or attack something on my territory? That is the right way to go about things. So if your opponent goes anywhere, like, backwards across this diagonal, or here, or here, or here, or like, here potentially, I mean, it can go to e4, like, you don't have to think about these moves at all. They don't do anything, right? So only the forward movement, that is what you need to really consider. And here, there is indeed queen takes g7, that hits the rook, and also grabs the pawn, attacks this one, that is really dangerous. Alright, now let me share with you another example, and at some point I will ask you to think about the position. So right here, how would you play here as black? Now you already know that there is a catch, right? Still, let's think about this. How would you play here as black? Now you probably have noticed that white is still threatening this queen takes f7 check, or maybe bishop takes f7, alright? And most players in this position go bishop e6, now in order to cover that pawn. So what do you think about this? Well, you know that before playing the move, you gotta ask yourself, what are the forward moves that my opponent can play on my half of the board and cause some damage? Now, what are those moves? What are the moves that white can play on black's side of the board, hopefully with certain attack or capture? Now, really, there are not many. If you think about meaningful moves, there is only bishop takes e6, and that is indeed just a trade of bishops. Or bishop takes c6, and that actually is not the end of the line, because if you ask yourself once again, what are the forward moves of white on my side of the board that would take or attack something, there's a continuation queen takes c6 with this double attack, and white wins the game on the spot. Which means that, if I take it back, which actually means that bishop to e6 was a losing blunder, so let me give you these 2 question marks, that was a losing blunder that lost the game on the spot. Whereas instead, actually black's position was totally fine. You just needed to cover with queen f6 or queen g6, and one of these moves would potentially, defend both of these weaknesses, and black is doing totally fine. Moving on to the next example, think about this position. If you're playing white, it is white to play. How would you play here if you're white? Here we can see that these knights are a little bit loose. This knight is only guarded by the other one, and this other one is also pinned down to the king. Therefore, white could play pawn d5, and since the knight is pinned and attacked and this knight is hanging, looks like white is about to win the game. In fact, d5 is the most played move by white. But actually, that's already quite a big mistake, because now all of a sudden black plays b5. What is that? Well, now you start to figure out that if the queen were to capture this pawn, there is knight to c2, forking the king and rook. And even if a pawn captures, there is still knight to d4, and black is taken over. Black's position is already better, and if white takes right here, then after knight to c2, black wins the queen straight away. Which brings us to the second rule to prevent blunders. Eliminate opponent's pieces on your side of the board. You gotta be a little bit more proactive. Don't wait till your opponent puts together some dangerous attack or tactics against you. Instead, think about those pieces on your side of the board and ask yourself, how can I kick them out of here so that there is never a problem for me in the future? And if the knight retreats, then think about this. Now it's much easier for you to navigate right here. You don't have to even be very careful, right? You can just play some normal developing move and you're totally fine, because your opponent's pieces are so far away from you, mostly, that they cannot play any attacking moves anyway. Here's another example. It is white to move, and I hope that at this point, the correct move is more or less obvious. Whereas before watching this video, you'd probably look at this position and think, okay, white can do whatever, like virtually any move of any piece or a pawn. But now you know that if there is opponent's piece on your side of the board, you gotta neutralize it, and that is the primary task that you're going to need to address straight away. So the correct move is queen e2, offering the trade, and black will have to either trade queens or go back. Either way, you're fine. You neutralized this attacker, and now your position is totally fine. After that, you can play, no, that would be a mouse slip. After that, white can play basically whatever move he wants to, and, your position is just fine. Now, let's compare that with the real game continuation. Here, white played rook b7, aiming to attack this pawn, also this pawn on f7. Looks attractive indeed, but now black can play pawn h4, threatening h3 and queen to g2 checkmate, and all of a sudden, that's an oopy-doopy situation. Like, what can you do? Basically nothing. Taken right here totally exposes the king. Black can play again queen h3, knight g4, queen h2 check, and black will probably win the game very quickly. Moving on to the next example, here black played bishop g4, pinning your knight, and what would you do in this position? It is white to play. How would you play? Most people in this position play bishop to e2, trying to neutralize a pin. Now, this is a passive solution, and of course, yes, you did neutralize the pin, but the problem is your opponent will keep coming. He can go knight f6, maybe attack this pawn, or maybe, I don't know, queen b6, putting pressure down here once again, or maybe pawn to e5, attacking this pawn once again. So he's got a bunch of ideas. Your opponent will keep coming, and you will have to always be super careful to navigate all these dangers accurately and to avoid blundering anything. So that is the downside of just playing passive defensive moves. All right, let's take it back and let's apply the rules we know so far. One of them is neutralize opponent's intruders onto your half of the board. Therefore, how about pawn h3? I'd say this move definitely would make a ton of sense if that pushed bishop backwards. Then I would say great move. But there is also one more rule that we have discussed so far, which is consider forward moving moves of your opponent. And forward moving moves doesn't sound nice, but you get the point. We gotta only think about this direction. If the bishop comes back anywhere, we don't care at all. Right? You don't have to think about that. Only this move is the one that you need to consider. So bishop takes, queen takes, again, same question. Is there any forward move onto your half of the board that takes or attacks something? As you think about this, you might notice knight takes d4, snatching this pawn, hitting the queen, and that is what we need to avoid. So you already can see how applying this rule easily allows you to prevent blunders. Nevertheless, that drives back the question, so how do you go about this? What do you do here? Which brings us to the third rule. Offense is the best defense. Think about this. We know that you do not want your opponent to come to your territory and create threats, which also means that the flip side of the same coin is correct. So you wish to do all that onto your opponent. You want to go to his side of the board and take or attack something, right? It's kind of like have them for breakfast before they have you for lunch. Now ask yourself this question. How can I go onto black side of the board and create threats? Are there any moves at your disposal? There's a move pawn d5 hitting the knight. Nice. Now you don't have to worry about this pawn anymore because you just push it forward. Alright, is there anything else? There is also a move bishop to b5 which pins their knight. Therefore the knight will no longer be able to take her pawn on d4. So bishop b5 and d5 both are equally great alternatives, and you solve a problem of a defense without ever making a defensive move. By the way, I call this move bishop e2 half a move, right? Because like realistically your bishop should have went forward into your opponent's side of the board, but somehow you kind of mouse slipped midway, right? So avoid half a moves. Instead, go full speed forward. Now, so bishop b5 or pawn d5, both are great. d5 is even more energetic. That is a straightforward threat in one move. Your opponent goes knight e5, still taking advantage of the pin, putting pressure down here. What do? I hope that right now your way of thinking is already very different compared to the crowd. So everybody will think, okay, this knight is attacked, I'm gonna go bishop e2 and defend it. But you know that it is a passive and weak strategy. Instead, ask yourself the same question. Can I go into my opponent's side of the board, create threats? Same with bishop b5 actually solves the problem. Now there is a check to his king, and that would automatically force him to turn around and to retreat, either his knight or bishop, but somehow he would have to retreat one of his pieces, which would again automatically solve a problem of defense without ever defending for you. But with all that being said, this knight got sick and tired of being used and decided to turn it into a nightmare. White can sack the queen right here, allowing black to capture the queen, and then continuing with this check. This way it turns out that black actually has no normal way to cover his king, but only to give up the queen back. But then you start collecting everything. You can capture the queen, this bishop, this pawn with a fork, the rook, like everything. This bishop, then the rook, and you basically destroyed half of his army and you got a totally winning position. Here's a little test. This time it's your turn to practice what we've learned and to find the right move for black. And if you can, please write it down in the comments below. Also, let me tell you that if you feel like you've been stuck in your chess progress for some time and your results are inconsistent and sometimes you blunder and you're not sure how to get to that next level, you're not alone. Guess what? This is actually the most standard situation that chess players find themselves into. Luckily, the solutions are also available and well known. So if you wish to implement those solutions into your chess, I've got a separate course, Level Up Your Chess, that you can check it out by clicking the link below the video, and it has everything, this anti-blunder training where you can practice, as well as everything else that you need to unlock that next level of chess progress, and I'll be happy to help. Either way, have a great rest of the day and take care.